Hello, my name is Robert Trussler, and I'm welcoming you to my tech talk. Well, it's not so much of a tech talk; it's more of a presentation on an adventure down the River Orinoco, which is in South America, Venezuela to be precise. And it's one that I'd like to share with you. Just a bit of background on myself for those who don't know me. My name is Robert Trussler. aka Captain Truffles within the industry and amongst friends. So I've worked for Griffin Hovercraft and Griffin Hoverwork as it is now for the past 25 years. I qualified as a Merchant Navy captain in 1998, and I took command of my first hovercraft later that year on charter in Lithuania. Over the years, I've gained quite a few type ratings, and to date, I actually hold 25 commercial type ratings for varying size hovercraft, from the baby of the fleet, the 380 TD, all the way through to the BHT 150 hovercraft. Also, just to add on that, even though I have had, or I do have, and hold 25 commercial type ratings, I've possibly driven more commercial types of hovercraft than anybody in the world, and that's all around the world that I've had that privilege to do that, which has been, great fun. One of the challenges of being able to drive all these different hovercraft is especially on one day that I might end up driving 3 craft, depending on what we're doing on that day and what craft we're trialing in the yard. So I might one day be driving in the morning a 380 TD, as I said earlier, the baby of the fleet, twin engine craft, but you steer the craft with your hands on a handlebar system. And then I might jump into a BHT 150, which is a completely different beast. Driving it with your feet, hands, 4 engines, and weighing up to 80 tons. And there's a big difference between 1.3 tons to 80 tons in the build-up, especially in close quarter manoeuvring with the kinetic energy. So it does get some getting used to, but I love the challenge, and it's really good fun. But enough of that. Let's move on to the last great journey on Earth again. So most hovercraft enthusiasts know of the first great journey on Earth, but for those who don't, I'll just give you a brief outline of what it entailed and what it was all about. David Smithers is probably the greatest hovercraft explorer ever to date. He led the 8,000 kilometer Trans-Africa hovercraft expedition, and was also the leader of this journey in the Amazon in 1968, where they were trying to go from Manaus in Brazil all the way up through Brazil, Venezuela, out to the Caribbean. And the route was supposedly non-existent because nobody knew at the time of the Casacari canal or river, which joined the 2 great rivers, which was the Orinoco and the Amazon. So they used Saunders Roe N6, which was Hover Travel's craft, which was operated under Hoverwork, which was a sister company to Hover Travel. And the pilot in charge, or the main pilot, was Roland Graham Clark, Uncle Graham to myself and my brother. And he was accompanied with his co-pilot, Captain Stuart Syred from the Royal Marines. And there were also scientists, biologists, newspaper reporters from the BBC, and the National Geographic team, who actually sponsored the whole adventure for them. The adventure did prove more treacherous than the Trans-African adventure, mainly because this had never been done. No vehicle or nobody had ever attempted to do this inland trip, and nobody knew of what was ahead of them, what they were going to find. There was rumours of cannibals, and it was a major logistical problem for them. There was no charts or maps. They actually used aeronautical maps or charts to actually try and navigate their way through the rivers. And one of the obviously the big famous part was obviously the N6. There's video footage of it coming down the Apures rapids up by Puerto Ayacucho, which is in Venezuela, and it's incredible. The river is obviously at full flood. The water's not so as turbulent as it is when it's lower. It's very fast flowing, but there is still some major drops in water, and it's very, very impressive if you ever get the chance to see that. So moving on, let's talk about the last great journey on Earth again. The hovercraft chosen to undertake this last great journey on Earth again was Griffin's Demonstrator, a 2000 TD Mark II. To be honest, it was the only craft we had at the time. This was a small piece of history, hovercraft history in itself. It was the first of type to be built under the new construction rules and regulations of the High Speed Craft Code of 1997. For example, forward-facing seats, and for this size of craft it's quite a challenge to maximise the passenger footing, 20 to 22 people. Crash bulkheads for the entire length of the craft to protect the main cabin from flooding in the event of a crash or structural penetration through the side of the craft, and noise in the passenger and cockpit area had to meet the new standards. The craft was built for a customer in Miramar, carrying hotel guests to and from their hotels to destinations up and down the Oregon River. The craft was brought back to Griffin when the Asian financial crash happened and was involved in many different jobs, from surveys on the River Clyde, crew transfer for dredging companies, carrying passengers and raising money for hover shows, including the preliminary demonstrations for Eon Productions, the company that produces the Bond movies. This led to John Gifford and myself driving the hovercraft in the movie. With myself and with the help of Tony Drake, we trained the stuntman in the film Die Another Day. The craft was involved in the court case concerning the devastating story of the cockle pickers in Morecambe Bay, as it was chartered and had to take the judge, jury and lawyers out to the scene of the incident. This was the first time in history a hovercraft had been used in legal proceedings, and especially the first time a whole courtroom had been taken to the scene of the alleged crime. It was my job to drive the hovercraft, and the day proved very stressful. Not only the pressures of carrying some important people, but at the same time, it was making world news. And there were news teams from all over, filming and recording the day's events. The last thing I needed was the hovercraft to be in the headlines for getting stuck in one of the mud gullies. Luckily, we got away with it. In '99, the craft, along with a 3000 TD, was taken up the Bewley River to the Abbey with myself and John Gifford at the controls to honour Sir Christopher Cockerell at his memorial service. After the service, we took Sir Christopher's family and friends out on the hovercraft. It was a great honour and a privilege to be involved in that day. After the Morecambe Bay job, the craft was stripped down and packed into a 40-foot container. The side bodies, propeller, duct were put in a 20-foot container, and everything was shipped off to Venezuela. It was my responsibility to pack the craft up with the help from the colleagues at Griffin. O42 arrives in Venezuela. Together with Griffin's sales manager, Matthew Gissom at the time, we flew out to Venezuela, and with the help of the Navy shipyard and our South American agent, Julian Seymour, we put the craft back together, ready for action. At this point, we were only aware of a few demonstrations we had to do in the port of Miranda, in the area called Valencia. Once the craft was assembled, we had to move the craft down a road to a launch site. The shipyard did not give us much room to manoeuvre. The road was on a slight incline, left to right, and full of vehicles. Well, the reason they're full of vehicles is most of them didn't start, or none of them started. So, top right-hand corner, I'm just going to play a short video, and you can just see the craft moving easily down the road. And I'm using quite a lot of port skirt shift just to try and stop the craft from sliding down the slope. Not that stressful at that point, just avoiding all the vehicles really at the time of that. Demonstration day, not too much of a challenge. Uniform on, shoes polished, and me and O42 on best behaviour. The area of the operation was not the best. The land area was extremely dusty, and the transition to the water was quite short and steep, so the craft suffers from porpoising, which you can see on this video. So you can just see there, as the craft went down, transitioned onto the water, you do get this porpoising effect. The craft quickly recovers from it, and we were off on our merry way. But it's just one of the reactions of the craft coming speed down the slope. So a short video here of the craft in operation in the harbour, coming back onto land. You can see there the naval ships, and then the craft just approaching the land, and we climb up onto the land area, and you can see quite a few people there, and most of them were news reporters or diplomats from the government. So another little quick video there. You can actually see the speed of the craft here through the harbour. Probably doing around 33 knots in the harbour. Just a little bit insight into the Navy's capabilities of Venezuela there. They did have an awful lot of frigates and submarines. And I believe the submarines came from Germany. So it was quite interesting of the military power they had. After the demonstration and presentations, well, yeah, I got the craft dirty, so here's proof. I washed it down. So there I am. You can see me there in my welly boots, and they brought a fire truck along and washed the craft down. At this point, there was a few rumours had started to present themselves at the time, and the president at the time, Hugo Chavez, had asked us to really prove the hovercraft, not just going round a harbour. And he said, if you get the hovercraft to a place called La Esmeralda, then he would be interested in looking at the hovercraft for his navy. We had no idea what was ahead of us. At this point, I had mixed emotions. Okay, so I'm just moving on to a bit about the river, basically, in Venezuela. On your left, you've got a map of Venezuela, the country, with Colombia running down the left-hand side, and Brazil at the bottom of Venezuela. The Orinoco River does divide down at the bottom there. It does divide the two countries from each other. And on the right-hand side, it just gives you the actual rivers. It's a map of the rivers in Venezuela itself, with the Orinoco, as you can see, feeding off from the Caribbean or running out to the Caribbean, running all the way east, and then running due south down, dividing the two countries, and then running into the Casacari Canal and out into the Amazon River. And then you can see the other main rivers or tributaries to the Orinoco from that. But just to give you some sort of more information on the Orinoco. So the Orinoco is one of South America's longest rivers, flowing around about 1,330 miles through Venezuela and Colombia, as I said, and emptying out into the Caribbean Atlantic Ocean. The Orinoco River drains an area of approximately 340,000 square miles, and more than 75% of this land is located in Venezuela. So from all that rainfall coming down into the river, from the jungle and so on, and from the mountains. 340,000 square miles is covered by the river, with the rest of it being divided up then with the Columbia. The Orinoco itself is divided into 4 sections. So you've got the upper, the top end of it, middle, lower, and then the delta of the Orinoco. The river itself flows in a giant arc through the rainforests and flooded forests and grasslands and the delta from where it begins, up in the Parima Mountains, and the main tributary, as saying earlier about the rivers, is the Apori River, which we'll go into talk about later because we took the hovercraft up the Apori River. The river itself, or Venezuela, benefits obviously being a rainforest with the wildlife. So it has many different species of animal, including the giant anaconda, giant river otters, river dolphins, and the Orinoco crocodile, which all of them are critically endangered. Just going on about the crocodile, it's also one of the world's largest crocodile species, and can reach up to and over 20 feet in length. Going on from the sort of the waterborne animals, there's obviously airborne animals, as you can say. So parrots, parakeets, flamingos, and the scarlet ibis, for instance, make the water's edge and the jungle their home. And one very important fact, or an amazing fact actually, during the winter and summer seasons, obviously the water level is going up and down. But just to give you some figures, that when the river is in full flood, it has an average depth of 165 feet in the winter months, and then in the summer months, as little as 49 feet. So it's over 100 feet in scale of depth. It's quite incredible. But we'll carry on with the next slide. Okay, O42 was packed up and loaded onto a 40-foot articulated lorry. The propeller and duct were left on, as the craft are designed to be shipped on a lorry with everything intact, except for the side bodies being folded up. I know the top left picture is not of O42 in Venezuela, but it is of O42 being unloaded in Morecambe Bay for the trial. It's just to show you how the craft looks, because I didn't actually have a picture of the craft in Venezuela folded up properly, but there is one of it being unloaded there off a lorry there on the bottom right. Myself and Matthew and Julian were on our way back to Caracas, which is the Venezuelan capital, from the naval base in Puerto Miranda, district of Valencia, which is about a 5-hour drive on a good day, when we got a phone call asking us to come back, as the lorry had tried to go under a bridge to find that the craft was too high to go underneath. We turned around thinking of the worst and hoping that the duct and prop hadn't been damaged. We arrived back at the naval base in the middle of the night to find that the duct had only suffered a few minor nicks and scratches, and I got on with removing the duct and prop and loading them onto a smaller truck for transportation. We got our heads down for a few hours at the naval base, and we were up bright and breezy for the start of our mammoth cross-country trek. So just to give you an example, just to make you appreciate where we had to actually drive from, was Puerto Miranda was in the top left there, and we drove basically through the day and night to get to Puerto Ordaz, which is to the east of Venezuela. So myself and Julian shared the driving, which was his 1980s BMW 7 Series V12 straight six, well, 2 straight sixes bolted together to make it the V12. And it was great fun. We had a lot of fun driving that. And bearing in mind, Julian was nearly 70 at the time, I did the night driving. We drove for 22 hours non-stop across the country. And the night driving, as I mentioned, was particularly scary, as the roads are completely unlit, and the other cars on the roads, well, they didn't have much lights either. If they did have lights, it was only half a light working on the car. So, and there was certainly at night, there was parts of Venezuela you didn't want to stop in. But we did make it. And as the trip was being run under the naval banner, officers were desperate to impress. They just wanted us to get straight on with the build of the craft and get it onto the river. We were pretty knackered and needed to get some shut-eye. And after some raised voices, we were allowed to get some rest. So in the morning, we started to reassemble the craft. So the craft was reassembled in a car park in Puerto Ordaz, which was a lively town. We did demonstrations to the local mayor and emergency services, and everything seemed pretty pleasant on the river. Sun was out, river was calm. A strong current though. The river was running around about 6 knots, but O42 performed flawlessly, brilliantly. And everybody who went on the craft thoroughly enjoyed themselves. So from the order from President Chavez at the time, we started to make our way from Puerto Ordaz down the river. So we took the craft to a naval posting where we loaded the craft spares, our personal clothing, and military personnel. These being a doctor, radio operator, 2 commandos, 2 naval captains, and a cameraman. At this point, Matthew had to leave us and fly on to another country on GHL business. So it was just myself and Julian as a GHL reps. Me multitasking as chief spanner monkey at night and driver during the day. We're also going to be escorted with 2 Boston whalers, which are the Venezuelans' river boats. We also had a helicopter for overhead protection. At this point, I did start to wonder what we've got ourselves into. We set off with a little idea of what was ahead of us and what we were in for, and absolutely no idea at all the size and power of the river, nor the complete absence of civilization or communities, and communication for hundreds of miles. So there on the map, you can see where we started at Sidra Bolivera, and we went to Mpori. And it was only 128 miles, say 128 miles. But that was small fry to what we ended up doing. Average speed, 20 to 25 knots. Beautiful countryside. It was an awful lot to take in, but it was the start of the adventure. So just a few pictures here just to sort of take you through what it was all about, really. So the top left picture, our doctor on board, when we did stop at places on the way down, or even just to stop for lunch somewhere or something, the local doctor did attend to the locals where he could. Bottom left, the way we got the craft fueled, military style. Bottom right, car parking space for the craft on the side of the riverbank there, and top right, myself and Julian looking over the engine bay, just doing some pre-operational checks. Just a few more pictures before we carry on with the adventure, really. So the top left, a view of the river and the vast sandbanks, and I mean the sandbanks just went on for miles and miles and miles. As I said earlier, that the time we were there, it was the summer, and the river was low, very low, in fact. But when the wind blew in either direction, up and down the river, it did have a real impact on the craft. The river would be from, a few hundred meters wide, or to the width of the craft at some points, to a mile wide. So the wind would really whip down the river. and it would slow the craft down quite considerably. And we would only ever sometimes achieve 15, 18 knots. So we were just sort of above primary hump speed. And there's just a few other pictures there, craft parked on a sandbar, just so we can go and stretch our legs. Some more engine checks and some other sandbars. Or the bottom right is actually a view from my position driving the craft, and you can see some of the sandbanks we went over. This time of year, as I said, February, water levels were low and the river was exposing massive sandbanks. And we could never drive the craft fully on them. We always sort of skinned the edge because the height of the sandbanks would go up a couple of meters, and the last thing I needed was the craft sort of disappearing off a sandbank cliff. So we only ever really skimmed the edges of the sandbars, which made the craft go faster anyway, and we were in shallower water. So the second leg was from Marapa to Kaikara del Orinoco. Kaikara is actually quite a well-established town, and we were able to spend a night in the hotel. The Navy organised fuel for the craft, and this came to us on a truck in the form of 40-gallon drums. And that leg was 105 miles. In Kaikara, we picked up a navigator because from Kaikara onwards down to Esmeralda, the charts that the Navy had were still not very good, and there are so many small tributaries running off the main river, you could so easily get lost. So we picked up a navigator who was actually, as a child, remembered the N6 stopping at Kaikara when it was coming up the Orinoco, heading out to the Caribbean. And he's actually seen there in this picture on the top left, on the bow of the craft. And he knew the river so well. He had grown up on the river and he had memorized the river in so much detail. And he communicated to me by whistling. Starboard, one short whistle, and port, two, just as it is with the horns on a ship or boat. But he did it by whistling. And he really understood hovercraft and how it worked. Throughout the trip, we did cut, I don't know, tens, maybe hundreds of miles, not hundreds of miles, 50, 60 miles off the whole trip, just by cutting corners on the river and going over the smaller sandbars, because he just understood the concept of a hovercraft. So after 8 hours solid driving, we arrived in Ayacucho. We found a safe place to park and put the craft on the riverbank, and we went off to the naval barracks for some food and rest. We spent a couple of days in Ayacucho doing some demonstrations to the naval officers and local mayors and business people. Ayacucho is the last major town that could be accessed by road. From now on, it was by river or by air to go anywhere, and we were on our own. Ayacucho also boasts the famous rapids that the N6 went down. To check the rapids out, I asked the Navy to show me the rapids so we could see if we could get 2,000 down them. So myself and Julian and our Navy captain jumped into a truck and he took us to the start of the rapids. We happily got out the truck and had a quick sandwich and a bite to eat, and we were completely unaware of what was going to happen next. They took us down to the riverbank to be presented with an 8-man inflatable catamaran. It was a small 8-person cat, a small outboard strapped to the back with 40 litres of petrol strapped to it. Just going back to the map, you can see the distance of the next leg of that leg from Kaikara to Ayacucho was 199 miles. So our distances were starting to increase, and obviously every time we stopped or started from, it was from a naval posting. So we could demonstrate to the naval officers of each of those postings on the way down the river. So myself and Julian, we had absolutely no idea of what to expect. So myself, pen and chart in hand, I started to make a route through the rocks as we gently floated down the river, thinking to myself, it looks possible, this. As mentioned earlier, this time of year, the river was low. So the river had uncovered rocks. And when I say rocks, these things were the size of houses and bigger. And the downside was, because the river was so low, the gaps between the rocks were not big enough to get the craft down, along with the enormous drops and the very fast flowing turbulent water. My chart and pen did not last long, with the sound of fast flowing water ahead and the faces of my colleagues on board starting to look a little anxious. We hit the first stage of the rapids. A few drops of 3 meters. Yeah, we got wet, and our postures certainly changed from sitting in the boat fairly relaxed to looping our hands through the handles on the boat and holding on for dear life. The boat driver had a cheeky grin on his face. Once we came out of the first stage of the rapids, I had a little quiet chat to myself. Ah, what the bloody hell am I doing? We carried on the rapids and they got more violent with bigger drops and huge reversing waves. I mean, we're talking 5 to 7 meter drops, and the waves, reversing waves, were that size. And the little boat we were in just took it. I remember looking at the engine a few times to see it underwater, and it just kept going. I thought to myself, if that little thing can do it, I certainly can. We eventually came out of the rapids 40 miles or so, which took us around 4 hours in our little boat. There's lots of cheering and back slapping to each other. I spoke up and said, I don't think it's wise. I don't think we can get the craft down the rapids. If the water was higher and there are fewer things to hit, i.e. the very big rocks, I think I would have given it a go. The Navy did ask for a demonstration of the craft in the lower end of the rapids, which I did agree to. The craft handled extremely well in the rapids, but when the peaks and troughs become greater than the cushion depth, the craft started to suffer and the hull would start to make contact with the water, and we would have water over the windscreen. Unfortunately, one of the downfalls of an open loop segmented skirt is it's extremely soft in its cushion, extremely efficient, but extremely soft. The N6 had a bag and finger, which was a very hard cushion, so it was less affected by the size of the peaks and troughs. The Navy agreed, so we got the craft out of the water and folded it up and put it onto a truck and took the craft to the other side of the rapids, reassembled the craft and got it back into the water. One thing I'll just sort of say about the rapids at Ayacucho, I do feel I'm privileged and think I was stupid at times to have done the Tours Rapids and Mapuru Rapids. I am gutted to the time of year. The water wasn't higher and we could have given it a go. But it is an experience I will never forget, and it's few that many Westerners haven't done. So from the map, you can see our next leg. And this was from Ayacucho to San Fernando do Apure, 134-mile leg. Now, this was probably one of the most exciting parts of the leg because it divides Venezuela with Colombia. During this leg, we had our excitement. We came around a bend in the river to be confronted with the Boston whaler in front of us. With half a dozen very well-equipped men, we didn't know if they were Venezuelan or Colombians. The men on the Boston whaler came over to us, shouting and waving guns at us. We knew the Colombian Navy or guerrillas, drug lords, worked in this area, but they were so well equipped, they have the same equipment as each other, down to the clothing and weapons. At this point, we did not know who they were, if they were Colombian Navy or drug lords. It was squeaky bum time. Guns were pointed. Myself and Julian took a back seat. Well, hid the best we could. The then captain came into full use at this point and was able to diffuse a potential real issue. For certainly myself and Julian being expats, and for the hovercraft. After some very heated conversations and gun waggling between the then captain and the guys on the boat, it was established they were Colombian Navy. Phew. But we weren't out of the woods yet. A lot of questions asked about the hovercraft and where we were going, and they wanted to search the hovercraft, checking if we would smuggling drugs. But to be honest, we were actually driving down the Venezuelan side of the river, but it's not as if a white line's painted on the river. So Colombians and Venezuelans do swap either side of the river quite regularly. A few packets of cigarettes and some cash were handed over, and they let us go, which it wasn't my cash, I hasten to add. The base commander at San Fernando de Apure became a good friend of mine. When we first met on a sandbar, he wanted me to drive for at least 2 miles to his base to collect some rations, etc. But I refused, as the sand was really dry and dusty, and I didn't want to get the air filters of the craft clogged up. With Julian pleading with me, as salespeople do, I stood my ground and said no. From that day forward, the captain and I became good friends. I guess it was a captain-captain thing, and respected each other's for our responsibilities. To the point, when in conversation, he found out Marie was expecting our first child, Jake, and his wife was expecting a little girl too around the same time. He's presented me with a handmade mobile to hang in Jake's room. The mobile was made from local Indians and was birds found in the jungle. So just a few pictures here showing you San Fernando de Apure. A bit of sandbar we stayed on near the captain's base. You can see the top left picture there, Julian looking at the stuck together map of the river and seeing the best way for us to get to Esmeralda, and me thinking how much further, there's another 200 miles or so. In the top right picture, you've got the base commander in the middle of the three, and our Venezuelan Captain Savasi, who, just to add, Captain Savasi was actually a submariner, but he'd been involved with getting the hovercraft into Venezuela, as he was looking at hovercraft and putting it forward for naval applications. So just moving on, this is a short clip of the craft 042 departing a sandbank in San Fernando, and we're going off to get some fuel. Just a quick spin on the spot, pretty much, and we're off to go and collect the fuel. Notice how the sand there is getting sucked in through the prop there as I'm departing, and onto the river, and off we went. So just a few other videos here that the guys on the Boston Whalers took and handed over to us at a later date. And just to say, the guys on the Boston Whaler, I mean, a lot of them special forces, and they love seeing the hovercraft. Yeah, we'll just show you the first video here. So you can see the Boston Whalers there. There's my good friend, the captain, and the guys, special forces, completely face covered there, not showing his identity at all. The second video is just showing the craft going across the wake of the Boston Whaler. Pretty good speed, actually. And then the next video, we had a bit of a race on our hands, and you can actually hear from the engine tone of the Boston Whaler when he realised that we had a bit of a race going on. He stepped it up a gear, so I'll just play that to you now. And you might well ask why I'm running so close to the sandbank, and that is the water's shallower, and you can get the best speed out of the craft. And just in a minute, you'll hear the Boston whaler driver notch it up a gear. We're probably doing around 40-45 knots here, so stretching both the craft and the Boston whaler's legs. So it was good fun. He had a lot of smiles on his face when he got to meet us. So this is how we got fuel in the jungle. The Navy did it brilliantly. I mean, they're doing it on a daily basis, filling up the Boston whalers, obviously not with diesel, but with petrol. But every time we asked for fuel, they managed to get it to us. And this was probably one of the harder places to get to, because you can see how many guys it took to roll that drum down that steep rock face to get the fuel to us. So just another short little video that one of the Venezuelan naval guys took of the craft backing out of where we took the fuel. Now, it's quite interesting, this picture, because 042 had a fixed pitch 5-bladed wooden prop, so we had no reverse. So I had to use the air from the skirt to manoeuvre the craft. So to get the craft to go backwards, I had to ballast quite a lot of the fuel back to get the craft to move backwards. And you can actually see Julian and Captain Zavasi moving down the craft as well, so we could get the bow of the craft up. And then I'm using port skirt shift to lean the craft over to port, and we're using the air from the skirt against the water to manoeuvre the craft out of the position we're in. Because there was a pontoon on one side of me, on my port side, and there were some boats on my starboard side, so I was positioned. I was pretty restricted in manoeuvre there, right, the craft's length. But we got out all right. So to stop the propeller from spinning, so we stopped going forwards, we had a clutch pedal on the engine, and we were able to declutch the propeller transmission from the engine, so the craft was maintained hovering, and then when reducing the RPM, you could then engage the propeller again. So for us, this was the last big leg. So from San Fernando de Apure to Esmeralda, 219 miles, much the same really. Lots of water, lots of jungle. And we were completely reliant on 042 to get us there. So La Esmeralda, we arrived to be met by admirals and other high-ranking officers representing the president. We arrived late in the afternoon, and the plan was to carry out some demonstrations, which I then did, which all went very well. By the time we had finished, it was already early evening, worst time of the day, as the nasty bugs come out to play. The naval posting, the resources were limited, which you can understand, being in the middle of the jungle. But why would you have such a good runway? I'll let you think of those reasons, but to give you a clue, there was a retired officer who lived on the edge of the runway, very, very posh, well furnished, and he had a small jet parked in its own hangar next to the house. I'll let you think how he got there. So I said naval resources limited. Myself and Julian ended up sleeping on some makeshift bunk out of some planks of wood in the galley. And my shower that night was from the river water in a 40-gallon drum, using a saucepan, pouring water over my head. A little bit about Esmeralda. Esmeralda is as far south as you can get in Venezuela. It's 3 degrees north, 65.5 degrees west. The next stop is the Amazon jungle of Brazil. Nothing there except dense vegetation, rivers, indigenous Indians with curicuri tipped arrows. Yet in Esmeralda, we met 2 lady doctors, and they were doing investigation work in conjunction with the London School of Tropical Medicine. And it was a good job too we met them, as the following day, the puri gnat bit me, and they bite viciously and are smaller than a mosquito, but they don't just sting, they take a chunk of flesh as well. Only a small piece at each time, but when you get bitten 50 times plus, you feel pretty ill. I certainly did. My blood pressure went through the roof, and the two lady doctors started to have, well, they did have some concern. They gave me some serious drugs to sort my blood pressure out, and as I was basically gone into shock from the bites. I explained to the doctors that the plan was for me to drive the hovercraft back down the river, back the way we had come, and they said no. They suggested to the Navy that I was flown out by helicopter so I could get some proper medical treatment and get myself back to 100%. So there's two sides to the coin here. One, I got flown out by helicopter, and I saw the vastness of the jungle, which I will just show you in the next slide or so. I've got some video from the helicopter. It also gave us all a rest. It'd been pretty full on since we arrived in from the initial demonstrations, and it gave the Navy time to discuss with the President and his officials and helpers how to progress the hovercraft project. We had done what he asked. We got to Esmeralda. It was time for him to sign up to his side of the bargain. So yeah, so we'll just move on to the next slide, which just gives you an indication and shows you just the vastness. I mean, the pictures don't give you the full extent of the river and of the jungle. But I'll just play the first one from out of the helicopter. And just, I know the video doesn't really give you the full view. It's just from my phone at the time, hanging out the side of the helicopter, but it just gives you an indication of, how isolated we were. And if we'd had a problem, we had no means of communication. Telephone signal doesn't work. So, we were completely reliant on 042. And just another clip from the helicopter, and you can see the river winding there. And this point, the river is actually quite narrow because, as I said, the water levels were low. Later on in this presentation, you can see when the river is flooded. So just moving on from that. So we left the hovercraft in Esmeralda, expecting to return in 2 weeks. And the idea was that the Navy were going to bring us back in a Hercules. And then we were going to take the hovercraft back to San Fernando de Apure. But in the meantime, the Orinoco had flooded, covering 2/3 of the runway. So the C-130 was out. There's only two more options for us to get to Esmeralda. Firstly was to hire a boat, and secondly a light aircraft. So, safety records and that, we decided to go on the boat option. So, because we felt somewhat safer than flying over the mountains in the dense jungle. We chartered a boat, and it was going to take us 2 days to go up the river to Esmeralda. We arrived to find the boat, well, it could only be described as a 20-foot bathtub, really. All of the boats had petrol outboards, so as you can guess it, we realised we were going to need a lot of fuel. The locals had strapped 400 litres of petrol to the front of the boat and provided us with sandwiches as well. Suddenly, myself and Julian decided the boat option really wasn't the way forward. So Julian put his hand in his pocket and he hired a Cessna 207 from Ayacucho. It was pretty bashed up, dented wings, rivets popping out, a bit of gaffer tape, but then who has never used gaffer tape before? And we stupidly went off. As soon as the pilot climbed and trimmed out about 500 feet, he took his newspaper out and spread it across the dashboard to read it. With nothing but jungle and mountains below, this wasn't a welcome sight. I later learned from Julian that one of the passengers was chanting in Spanish, "We're dead, we're dead," throughout the flight. I'm glad I didn't understand Spanish, and I still don't understand Spanish. And even more, I wish I'd never asked Julian. I guess the plane knew the way, like the old dog she was. The landing in Esmeralda was, let us say, short-filled, and the brakes, well, they were smoking when we thankfully got off. I then turned around just as I was getting off the aircraft and looked in the back, and there was 75 litres of petrol in the back in plastic jugs. Guess they're not under CAA rules, but you can't run out of fuel. We found the craft where we'd left it, but not quite in the same condition. As earlier said, the river had risen with the amount of rainfall, and the craft was surrounded by water. We got into a dugout canoe and rowed it to the craft, which was looking pretty sorry for itself, actually. Bow was high in the air with the stern touching the ground. Due to the deluge of rain, the engine bay had flooded. When lifting the engine cover, the water was halfway up the engine, covering the alternator and starter motor. Not a good start. Many buckets of water and hand pumps. The engine bay was empty and the craft was floating again. On A42, which goes back from the CAA days, you were able to isolate the alternator actually on the dashboard. So we decided to start the craft up with the alternator isolated, and we moved the craft onto the runway as there was nothing else flying in that day to carry on with the drying process. We got everything sorted, and with a lot of WD-40, we started turning on other systems of the craft, and we eventually turned on the alternator circuit, and the craft was amazingly self-sufficient, and we were ready for the off. The naval guy in Esmeralda who was helping us to get us launched and on our way said we had to go down the runway a bit further and go between some houses because the slipway that we originally came up was completely cut off now, and we couldn't get back past it because of the buildings and some fallen trees. So we drove the craft down the runway and went through some very long grass to find that the craft then got stuck on a mesh fence that he forgot to tell us that was in there, and was hidden by the tall grass. So we had to stop the craft on this fence, which from the weight of the craft did collapse, and I had to go underneath and start undoing skirt segments and to untangle it from this fence and cut the fence away. And then we replaced the segments back together. And then with a long rope and a truck, we managed to get off the fence and ready for our return trip. Now, a lot of this I've done, obviously this bit I've done by memory, and I don't have any photographs of the incident because, we were on a time frame and a time limit, and it was just myself and Julian, and we had to get the craft back. Well, sorry, myself, Julian, and our Captain Savasi. It was just the three of us that went back on the return trip. Just saying that, just going back a couple of steps. Obviously, at the beginning of the talk, I said we had a doctor, two commandos with weapons, a cameraman, and so on. When we got to Ayacucho, all these people disappeared. They said, "We're not carrying on. It's too dangerous." So it was just myself, Julian, and Captain Savasi who did the remaining trip down to Esmeralda from Ayacucho. And the three of us went all the way back to San Fernando de Rapori. So yeah, once the craft was off the fence, and a little altercation with a rope, which is another story, which is why you never play with ropes and hovercraft, or especially propellers. We stopped. We were off. We stopped at the naval stations we stopped at on the way down, to take fuel and to get some sleep. And we went all the way back to Kaikara. So we navigated all the way back to the north, to get back to Kaikara, to find out, once we got to Kaikara, that the Navy then wanted us to go back to a place called San Fernando de Rapori, which was 129 miles away. And this was one of the major tributaries to the Orinoco. So here on the map, just a little section, as I've done with all the other maps. You've got a blow up on the left there, of this sort of detailed part, and then you can see on the right hand map the sort of extent across the country distances we're talking about. So as we've said earlier, the river was low, so because the Orinoco was low, obviously the Rapori River was low. And it's a much smaller river, and there's places on the river that it was only as wide as the craft, so it was a really tight squeeze to get the craft through these parts of the river. And the riverbanks, they were 15 to 20 foot above us. And I always remember that the villages all the way along, all the way to San Fernando, there was these small pockets of civilization, and all the way up the river, the villagers, the children, the adults, and that they would all come down looking at this machine, wondering what it was. Most of them, they didn't know what a hovercraft was, but they were smiling and waving at us all the way up. And I don't know if they knew we were coming from the noise, or they had smoke signals, or what it was, but each village on the way up were out in force to see us and welcome us as we went past, which was a beautiful sight to see. So end of the road, 1,500 miles later, 97 hours hovering time, including demo time, 4,850 litres of diesel, 2 litres of oil, 7 weak link shackles, 1 pair of pants and socks. I was joking there. Obviously, had more than 1 pair of pants and socks. A lot of bottles of water. We made it. It was the first time a hovercraft circumnavigated, being in both directions of the Orinoco. We did some demonstrations to the locals and the mayor of the city and to Navy personnel. The trip was spectacular, as the Orinoco is so huge and immensely powerful. As I said earlier, most of it is more than a mile wide, and in some places at full flood it's up to 5 miles wide. The current runs around about 6 knots, and at low water it's full of minefields of eddies, whirlpools, backflows, and these, you could feel them. They did affect the craft. They didn't ever affect the performance. It just slowed the craft down a little bit. You could feel the air, especially the whirlpools. You could feel the air being sucked out of the cushion as we passed over them. The faster speeds, the effect was quick. The craft would sort of just go along. It sort of dipped down, and then it would spring back up as it sort of went over these whirlpools. We provided what we could to the indigenous people, and we did meet a lot of people, especially from the smaller villages. When the doctor could, when he was with us, he attended to the young and the old, Julian had bags of sweets with him, and I never could understand why until we got down to these smaller villages, and he would give out the sweets to his children. And they'd never seen a boiled sweet before, so it was lovely to see the smiles on their faces as they was tasting these sweets. We saw river dolphins, all sorts of birds, parrots, parakeets. We saw crocodiles, snakes, and some pretty big ones, and of course piranha. The scenery was beautiful. It's indescribable. If anybody ever gets a chance to go to South America to explore the jungles, you just won't be disappointed. You are always so surprised, or you're overwhelmed by the size of the jungle. So back to the craft. The craft was packed up and shipped back to where we'd started with the initial demonstration back in Porto Miranda. And after the trip, the Navy awarded myself and Julian with a certificate of recognition. And from the successful trip, more hovercraft have been sold to Venezuela. And in fact, to other South American countries, Peru and Colombia, Griffin have sold craft to. But there lies a completely set of different stories. But I would like to mention the craft that have been supplied to Venezuela, and that's AP 188 -200, an 8000 TD, and a 1000, and including 042, because after the successful trip, the Navy purchased 042. And all of those craft I've had the privilege to pilot for the first time in this amazing country and environment, and train the Navy's pilots. So just sort of going on over the next few slides, if you haven't all fallen asleep already, I've got a few pictures and videos of the AP-188 Arauca, which the Navy called her, on the river. One of the days we were taking the craft up the river, I averaged a speed for over 4 hours, over 50 knots, which was just amazing. It was a real buzz. So we did that from Porto Ordaz to Caicara. After we had packed the craft up, and the craft was on its merry way back to Miranda, the port where we first started off this mammoth trip, myself and Julian jumped in a car and drove back to Caracas, with a few days later getting a telephone call from Captain Savasi, saying that he would like us to come down to Valencia, to the port where his headquarters were, to present us with a certificate, which was a certificate of recognition. And this had been authorized at the time by President Chavez, and was issued on behalf of him and the Navy in recognition of what we had done on this amazing adventure. And there's the next slide will just show you a picture of that, and it's just there for prosperity for me, just to remind me of the trip and the memories that I've picked up over the years. So here's as I said just a second ago, here's a couple of pictures of the craft that we have sold into, Griffin have sold into Venezuela. Top left, you've got the 1000 TD, and that was primarily used and designed with the for surveying and mapping the rivers, particularly the Apuri River. Top right, you have the 8000, and bottom left and right, you have the AP-188 and 8000 together in Caicara. The 8000 and the AP-188 were both brought in as part of the President's presidential election campaign at the time. So President Chavez purchased these two craft to try and get the indigenous people to vote for him. A few more pictures of Arauca and Apori. The Apori was the name for the 8000, and Arauca was the AP188. Just a few more pictures there, offloading the craft. One with Julian's car, where it's actually his wife's car on the bow of Arauca. A picture of the GPS readout of 55 knots. We did top out at 60 knots at one point, and this was at maximum continuous rating on the engines. At no point did we ever, or did I ever, put the pedal to the metal. She just went off on her own, and we didn't have to go any faster than that. It was fast enough. You can see on the top right, I said earlier that the river was low. When we took Arauca, the water was high, and it was an immense difference. This was running up the Apori River to San Fernando, and with the 2000, as I said earlier, the riverbanks were 15, 20 feet above us. Now, the water had swallowed up most of the jungle, and the river was, in places, a couple of miles wide. We were cutting corners and we were going over what was dense jungle. Absolutely incredible. So a short video here running up the Apori River. Some of the bends in the river were more than 90 degrees. I'll just play the video here. So unfortunately, the camera doesn't really give the impression of speed, or really give you the how sharp the bend in the river is. But we're doing over 40 knots here, and it's over nearly a 90-degree turn, which was great fun in this size of craft. Having to use obviously all the controls to get the craft round the turn, bow thrusters as well as rudders and throttle on the propellers. Bow thrusters obviously controlling bow thrusters and rudders, controlling the rate of the yaw, and also the bow thrusters initiating the turn by rolling the craft into the turn. So this is another video of Arauca landing at Kaikara alongside the naval HQ. Seamlessly effortless driving the craft up there. So just another video of Arauca. As I said earlier, it doesn't really give the effective speed. It does a little bit there where the camera, person who took the film, actually moves the camera to the side. You get a bit more of an impression of speed. So when we were at San Fernando de Apori with Arauca for demonstration, because it was all live on TV, they asked us to put a tractor on board, and it happened to be a red tractor as the hovercraft and as the president's colours, all red. So we did took the craft out with the tractor on board, and went out on live television for his election campaign, and it went very well. So a little bit off topic here with not necessarily talking about hovercraft, but in San Fernando, we made a friend, this otter, and she was as tame as a dog. She loved having her tummy tickled, and she was brought up by a fisherman, a local fisherman, and she used to go and catch the fish for him. And um, we're not quite sure what the story was, how the Navy ended up with her, but she was just a lovely, lovely animal. And it's the first time I've ever been able to tickle the tummy of an otter. Quite amazing. So as I was saying, the Orinoco, when flooded, oh, this isn't the Orinoco, sorry, this is the Apori River. This picture is just showing you the immenseness of the river. You know, as I said, that the pictures just don't really give you the scale of the river. But this was out of the wheelhouse of Arauca when Griffin members and the Venezuelan Navy took the craft up the river to San Fernando. You can see on the video here the craft running up the river, and that we were doing over 40 knots whilst going up the river. Which I have to be honest was a lot of fun at those sort of speeds. So hopefully, as I said, hopefully none of you have fallen asleep yet. We are on the last slide, and it is just to sort of bring the whole adventure and the experience together. So the last slide is a little short clip. It's our 30 seconds of Venezuelan fame, and this went out on the presidential channel, which was all part of his campaign. Now, when I play the video, there's going to be a lot of you saying, why did he drive through the sand? It all went through it, all the filters and all the rest of it. But what you can't see, and what I had to deal with at the time, and the crew on board the hovercraft, is that on my starboard side behind us, there was a row of tents and marquees which had all the TV equipment in, and all the personnel, the military, and all the food and all the rest of it. So I had no other option, but the only way to get into the river looking quite impressive was by going this way. So it does look pretty cool, and from it, you know, from seeing all the sand and stuff getting blown up, you can see some really cool airflows going into the lift fans and the three bow thrusters and so on. So here we go. We're just lifting the craft off, and you can just see what happened. So today, we've not heard anything from the Navy and how the hovercraft are, and it's quite understandable with what's going on in Venezuela currently. I hope one day hovercraft will be used again in Venezuela, and what myself and Julian did back in 2006 was a massive achievement. And we were completely reliant on a machine, 042, and it didn't let us down, not once. You know, we put fuel in, we put some oil in, changed a few weak link shackles, but the craft got us there. But there was some human element to it as well. Perseverance, excitement, knowing that there was history in the making, and sometimes complete stupidity. You know, it's not every day you put yourself in a rubber dinghy and go down one of the biggest sets of rapids in the world. But a few years later, with a team from Griffin in 2012-13, we were able to do it all over again. Not as far as 042 by some 1,200 miles, but it was just as exciting, and it was the first time that an AP-188 or an 8000 had ever been on the River Orinoco. We had our challenges, but that's another story for another day. What I've experienced and witnessed with hovercraft is truly remarkable. We've just scratched the surface of what a hovercraft can do and how it can help humanity in its quest to explore the unreachable places that a conventional vessel or vehicle can't do. And one day we will have hovercraft exploring these places that we can't get to by a conventional vessel. That's it. That's all I can say. Thank you.